Welcome to another episode of Growth Hacker TV. I'm Bronson Taylor, and today I have Hartley Brody with us. Hartley, thanks for coming on the program.
Great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Hartley, you began your career on the marketing team at HubSpot, and before that, you built a couple highly visible music websites, so you know something about growth. In fact, I actually came to you for help. You have a Clarity profile where you do consulting, and Growth Hacker TV came to you, and we set up a call. And I just picked your brain about, kind of a strategy that we were going to use. And we're systematically putting into practice almost everything you said. So it was very helpful. So thank you for that.
Excellent.
Yeah, no, so it was good. So I recommend other people to go check you out and do that as well. That's actually one of the problems is that you have so many talents. It's hard to know where to take an interview like this. Just to list off some of the things you do. You're a true growth hacker. You market and you write code. You're an expert on SEO, inbound marketing, thus the HubSpot stuff. But you also have another talent that we haven't really talked about on this show, and so that's what I want to dive into, and that's the notorious web scraping.
Yeah.
So let's spend some time talking about web scraping. Sound good to you?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, cool. So first, tell everybody, what is web scraping?
Yeah.
Is it the same as screen scraping? Are those words interchangeable?
So yeah, there's a lot of different terms people use: screen scraping, data harvesting, stuff like that. I mean, it's basically, I think most of those terms fall under the umbrella of just sort of web scraping. The idea is that it's essentially a way of pulling information and extracting content from a website, as opposed to an API or an RSS feed or something that's a little bit more structured. The content of websites is generally less structured than some other data feeds, and so having to parse through that takes a little bit more work, a little bit more creativity sometimes. But to me, that's sort of the definition that I have most commonly heard with web scraping is just extracting information and data from an HTML website.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like seeing an actual HTML page as a data feed. We usually don't. We usually just see it as data to be displayed, but not a feed to really harness and manipulate and use. Where we see APIs as, oh, they want us to use this data, they've put it in a nice, system for us to kind of get at. But you see the web, the whole web, as a big data feed, right?
That's right. And a lot of times, the reality is for most websites that people want to extract information from, there isn't an API. There isn't a sort of classical API. But by exposing that information via a website, there is essentially a structured document that's in your face that you can sort of browse through. And it takes a little bit of poking around to sort of figure out, okay, what are the container elements I need to look for, and how is this stuff all marked up? But usually things are pretty consistent, pretty straightforward, and once you just sort of pull up your inspector and kind of click around a little bit, you'll find exactly what you're looking for pretty quickly.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, but I want to hit on it a little bit now. APIs are super structured. HTML documents are still structured, just not as structured, right? So it's not like there's no way to see what's going on. It's just, it's less structured.
That's right, exactly. And we, if you mess around with websites or you build them or even just look at other people's websites, right-click and view source, there's a lot of repetition. And, people aren't handcrafting every single div that goes onto their page. They're saying, oh, we're going to have some images and we're going to wrap them all with an image and give it a class of thumbnail or something like that. So it's really easy then to go in and say, get me all the image tags that have a class of thumbnail. And that's essentially the same thing as taking a JSON response and saying, okay, give me all the elements in this list. I mean, it's essentially almost the exact same amount of work. And it's one of the main benefits of it is that it's just universally available. Any site that has a website has this sort of structured data feed. So they're loosely structured, but usually fairly structured.
Yeah.
And that's one of the big benefits of web scraping is just oftentimes it's the only option you have for getting data from someplace. But there are a ton of other benefits too. Like there have definitely been times where companies put out kind of shoddy APIs or they don't document them very well, and so you're trying to use it and you're saying, man, I'm passing in all the parameters that it says, but I'm getting back a weird response sometimes. And oftentimes APIs get sort of treated as second-class citizens where a company will, if it kind of degrades over time or things break or start spitting out errors, it doesn't get fixed right away. Whereas if their company's website goes down, That's sort of an all hands on deck, try to fix it thing. So
Okay.
oftentimes a website gets much more TLC than an API does.
Yeah.
So I've definitely found that that in terms of just sort of ease of use, sometimes you can actually, I find it easier to sometimes scrape stuff from a website than to try and wrestle through some poorly written, out of date documentation on something that might not even be there.
Yeah. And
Um,
APIs, they're not super easy to create. They take time, they take resources. So if you're trying to do something with a smaller company, that might be the only option you have. And one of the things you said, it's really about repeatability as well. It's about finding kind of the patterns in the code and then using those patterns to do what you want to do, right?
exactly, and I think the other thing you mentioned about it is extra work to build an API, and sometimes you read about the architecture of Netflix or how things work
Mm-hmm.
at Facebook, and internally they use a lot of APIs themselves. Where the I'm tripping over myself here. Uh, the concept of like a service oriented architecture where a
Yeah.
company has a bunch of internal APIs that they use. That usually isn't V1. That usually isn't the first version that a company builds. That's usually okay. We've
Mm-hmm.
got to scale this. We've got to grow this. We've got dozens or hundreds of engineers. Let's start to compartmentalize a little bit. If you're working on a site that may be a mom and pop shop
Mm-hmm.
or it's a startup or something, like very often they don't have an API out of the box. They're using, uh, you know, some hack together. Maybe they're using Rails or something like that or Django, but
Mm-hmm.
very often the API is not the first concern at a sort of smaller company where a lot of the data sometimes that you need might be coming from a company that just doesn't have the resources to put behind building an API essentially.
Yeah, and you talked about a company kind of using APIs internally to share their own data. And I could be wrong here, but maybe you've heard of this. I think Jeff Bezos at one point told Amazon you're not allowed to share data in the company unless it's in an API format because he was really going for this compartmentalized efficiency. Have you heard that?
Yeah, so there's this whole sort of school of thought that it's pretty big in the enterprise around service oriented architectures where basically you have stuff that's really siloed, and rather than having and Amazon was sort of, I think, one of the sort of people at the forefront of this, where you have some service, like let's say it's like your book recommendation algorithm, and you have some other service that's just like the data warehouse for all the like thumbnails.
Mm-hmm.
It's like those are two logically separate things, and they need to have sort of a concise, uniform, standard interface for accessing them,
Mm-hmm.
and that basically is an API. It's exactly what an API is. It's a standardized interface for accessing data.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than having a bunch of internal code that can, I'm working on the thumbnail team at Amazon. I need to call over to this thing. Rather than having it be like a function call that only I have special access to,
Mm-hmm.
I ping an engineer over there and I say, hey, could you add this thing to your API? And that way I can use it, but now anyone else in the organization can also use it. And third parties, people outside the organization, can also use it. So it's a good way to sort of structure teams, structure the sort of data and pipelines and stuff of a business.
Yeah.
But it does take a little bit more upfront work to sort of figure out what your services are and how they're going to act and what those interfaces look like. So usually you don't see it too much at smaller companies,
Yeah.
but definitely at bigger ones.
No, for sure. And now, some people watching this or listening to this, they know how powerful APIs are and web scraping. Like, they just get it. They understand what data can do and what data at scale can do. Some people are like, why are we talking about APIs on Growth Hacker TV? Why are we talking about web scraping on Growth Hacker TV?
Yeah.
So connect the dots for us. Give us some, like, meat and potato, real world, either possibilities or maybe things that actually happen. But tell us, like, why or how a startup could use this kind of thinking.
Yeah, so I do, because of the blog post, which I think will probably be in the link at the bottom, and the book that I've written, I get a lot of inbound requests. People have different questions about web scraping or want to know if I can help with this and that. And I picked up some really interesting freelance jobs over the past few months. And this one guy was basically running a business where if you have unclaimed property, after a certain amount of time, it gets forfeited to the government. And he was basically running a business out of his home that basically contacted people and said, hey, did you realize that you have unclaimed property, and we can help you file for it and do all the paperwork, and he takes a cut of that for doing that service. But he had a problem where he said, okay, I've got this set up and I've been sort of manually going through their site, or I wait for them to give me a data dump like once a year, but like they're posting new stuff all the time, and all my competitors are waiting for this sort of annual data dump, and it'd be great if I could really get a jump on it and contact these people first.
Uh-huh.
And I won't give out exact numbers, but there were lots and lots of zeros on the number of people in the state of California that have unclaimed property. And so for him, this is like he's gotten tons and tons of leads for his business, leads that he wouldn't have had access to otherwise, for people that, could really benefit from his services. They have literally cash sitting around that's theirs that they don't know about, and he's trying to get in touch with them. And it's so many people that there's just really no way for him to do it himself, and he doesn't want to wait for the government to sort of release this data dump. There's usually holes in it, and it takes them forever to do it, and some years they forget. And he was like, look, the data's there on the website. I'm not going to go through all these rows by hand. There's millions of them. But, what if I could just automate it? And so, it was a pretty straightforward web scraping. It was just said, hey, these pages have a pretty consistent format. Some of them are a little different depending on what kind of property it was. The class and IDs of the tables might change a little bit, but we went through one or two iterations, and I found that sometimes they split the address onto 2 or 3 lines. Sometimes they put it all in one line. So you sort of munge the data a little bit and you say, okay, here I've got a new consistent, a format that's pretty consistent. And then now I can just dump it into a CSV and send it to him, and he can put it in his, his mailing system, and he's gotten tons and tons of business from this. So it's definitely that's probably my favorite example of basically getting to bring lots of new leads and customers into his business, basically because we were able to automatically sort of harvest this information from a website when there really was no other way to get it before.
Yeah. And so lead generation is huge for this kind of stuff. So that's one application for sure, and that's an important one because that's where a lot of people make money.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this: in your experience, that's an example where obviously he's going to make a lot of money by doing it that way. In your experience, web scraping, is it a high growth channel kind of thing, or is it like a fringe thing you can do, but it's going to be marginal growth? Like, where does it fall? And is that even an accurate question to ask? Is it just it depends?
Yeah, it's tough. Here's what I'd say. I'd say that it's web scraping is a tool just like a sledgehammer is a tool, right? And sometimes, if you're building some kinds of buildings, a sledgehammer might be really useful because you might have to knock out a bunch of old stuff or something like that. But sometimes if you're building like a treehouse, you might not need a sledgehammer, right? So it depends on what you're trying to do essentially. Yeah. For lead generation, it can be super useful and super valuable. For a company that's more B2C, I'd have somewhat of a tougher time imagining it being used as a growth tactic. The other place that I've kind of seen it used is I think Feedly does a bit of it. They don't use it for acquisition as far as I can tell, but when they are showing me content, it's content that they've pulled from somewhere. Most of the time I think they're pulling it from an RSS feed, which is sort of halfway between a website and an API.
Yeah.
In that it's a little bit more structured than a website, but not there's different sort of specifications and things like that. But I think they also pull content from sites, and certainly those read it later sites where you put in a URL and it goes and pulls out relevant content and it ignores the ads and it ignores the sidebar and things like that. And, that's all web scraping. It's not being used for data acquisition, it's not being used for user acquisition. It's being used for data acquisition, but it's a tool to have in your arsenal that it makes a ton of sense for some businesses, and for others it might not fit as well into their strategy. But
I like those examples because it's now it's a whole different category of things it can be used for. So if I'm on Safari and some websites, it tells this data is structured well enough. If I hit the little reader button in the URL bar, it takes away all the images, or at least the ones I don't want to see, and it just shows me nice formatted text that's very readable with no anything else. But that's not on the person's website. That's Safari screen scraping, right?
Yeah, basically. And there's actually a bunch of different algorithms. There's sort of a friendly competition between a bunch of different groups that are working on algorithms that basically say, give me the messiest HTML document that you can, and I will try and pick out only the important parts and throw away all the stuff. And it's hard. I mean, depending on how heinous a site's markup is, it can be really hard for a program to tell what's the main content and what isn't. Yeah. Most of the scraping that I've done has been around we have a discrete number of pages where I can say I know exactly how each of these pages is going to be structured. For example, in the unclaimed property records, they all had the same table. There were a few differences in the rows and columns, but it wasn't like I was scraping that site and then 100 other sites that all use totally different stuff, and some of them might have used divs instead of tables and a bunch of different things.
Yeah.
To do things like that, you have to sort of take more guesses, and it's not as exact in terms of are you actually going to get the content that you want. So there are these algorithms that have sort of been proven out over time, that have been worked on by a lot of different people to sort of say, okay, how can we, figure out, where are let's look for some paragraph tags. Are there P tags on the page? Okay. Let's decide whether there's whether this feels like it's a body element, and so those get really complicated. And to do scraping across dozens of different domains is usually pretty tricky. Most of the web scraping I do is like you have a site that's basically you have in mind what they're exactly, and you can look at it, you can click around, it's going to be fairly consistent, and then you just run it, and if there's an exception or an error, you say, oh, what is this weird case? Oh, I see. There was one time where I was pulling a bunch of data from some fashion retailers' sites. I think it might have been Nordstrom's or something like that. And they had a description of the item underneath the price and the add to cart button and everything like that. And there were like only 2 or 3 products in their entire catalog of products where instead of it just being a paragraph tag, it was like a bulleted list of things. And the first time I hit it, it was like, whoa, what is this? Like, this isn't flattened, this isn't just text, there's other stuff in here. But then you hit the error and you're like, oh, I guess this is a weird edge case, and you sort of design for it and go.
Yeah.
So I think that's the majority of web scraping is sort of tailored to a specific site. You have something in mind, and you can sort of hone in on what the content you want is. But there is also this other school of thought around doing it more algorithmically, where you say, okay, we might have to pull content from hundreds or thousands of sites. There's no way that we're going to be able to come up with all the different hooks that we need to find the content. We have to do it in a more automated fashion.
Yeah.
And that definitely gets a lot trickier to sort of do that well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I never really thought about it. Like, I guess I know it because the Safari example I gave is kind of the broad general algorithm. They're looking at every site you can throw at it almost and seeing if they can do it. But the land list that you gave is kind of the specific example. So I've seen both and I understand both, but I never really thought like, oh, that's 2 totally different like ways of approaching it. What you do with one is not the way you would do the other. It's just a different kind of thing.
Right, exactly. It's the same high level goal of pulling content from a site. It's just the sort of how much do you know ahead of time. It really depends. If you know exactly what the site's going to look like with a reasonable certainty, then you can hone exactly in on the data that you want. And it's basically just like saying, oh, I have this site's API. I know exactly how it's going to come back, what structure it's going to look like. I'm just going to load it as a dictionary or a hash table and pull out these keys. But sometimes you run into the thing where you're like, I don't really know what this HTML is going to look like or this JSON is going to look like, and you have to use different sort of tactics, but it's the same high-level goal of just getting the content.
It seems like with the general algorithm, I mean, you're just building in a lot of extra logic. If this happens, do this. If that doesn't happen, try this. If these both happen, make sure you do that. It's just like, because there's so many edge cases, because almost everything's an edge case now, right?
Exactly, yeah. And honestly, like I said, most of the stuff that I've seen is sort of the more straightforward, like someone has maybe 2 or 3 sites, maybe 1 site, maybe a dozen sites, and you just sort of go through them one at a time, and you say, okay, here's how this site does it, here's how this site does it, and that way you know exactly what you're getting. It's going to work with reasonable certainty. Because a lot of times, if you take like a random web page and run it through one of these give me a summary algorithm. I don't know if you've noticed this with Safari, but sometimes it might like cut off a bottom paragraph if it thinks that it's like part of an ad, or it might include the sidebar when it really doesn't, and it just like doesn't make any sense. Like, why is this in here? And so it doesn't always get it right. But if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of the quality, and the trade-off then is that you get more flexibility with your scraper, then that's definitely a way to go. Most of the applications that I've used web scraping for, they needed the data exactly the way that they wanted it, and so they wanted to sort of go in sort of by hand and pick out all of the divs and spans and stuff like that contain the information that they need.
Because usually you come to web scraping with a goal in mind. I want this kind of data from this exact site so that I can do this thing with it. It's not I want to web scrape for fun and profit. It's I have a goal in mind.
Exactly.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Walk me through the process, kind of the what you do when a client says, hey, I want you to screen scrape some stuff for me. Is the first step to kind of just go to the website, inspect element, and just see if the website even has the data that you want? Is that kind of step one?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, step one is basically saying, okay, I'm using a website as a data feed. In the same way that you might say, okay, I'm looking for information, where do I find it in this site's API?
Mm-hmm.
If you're deciding to go the web scraping route, you say, where do I find this information on their website?
So
that's
instead
the
of looking
first step.
through API docs, you're looking through their source code.
Right. It's basically like their website is a combination of the data you want and
noise.
Well, hopefully. I mean, if it's not, then web scraping might not work for you if you can't get it through their site. But the nice thing about a website is it's basically like the documentation and the API all in one. It's like, oh, I can click around and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm looking at all men's wear on J.Crew. Oh wait, I just want sweaters. Oh, I can click right there. I don't have to go read something about collections versus categories versus all. It just makes sense.
Theory. You're just in the code looking at how they title things.
Exactly, and then you just view source, and you just kind of go through it. And the other thing is that it draws me to it is that while there are really complex web scraping situations, at its core, it's really simple. And actually, this is, if we can sort of sidetrack into a higher level sort of HTTP, HTML discussion in general.
Yeah.
All it is, like when I'm accessing a website and I'm logging in, or that it's doing asynchronous, like you scroll down on Twitter and it loads more tweets. Like we have all these crazy things. There's JavaScript. I get like breathless questions of people being like, "Oh, I need to scrape this site, but it's uses single sign-on and OAuth and like at the core level, it's just text, right? You are when I'm loading Google.com, what's happening? My browser is sending a little blurb of text that says like HTTP GET, and then it has some information about the path that I want. It tells it the host. It passes a few more headers about what my browser is and where I'm located, and then there's a little bit more information at the TCP level and sort of going down through the stack, and then it just goes on a wire, goes through something else, and then it gets rebuilt into something complex on Google's side or the web server side, and then they do all their work to come up with a crazy response and hit databases and load things and check all these services. But then they say, great, we've got a response, let's send it back to the client. What do? It's just text. It may be an HTML document, it may be an RSS feed, it may be some JSON from an API, but all it is just a bunch of characters, and that goes down through the TCP levels, gets put on the wire, run across the wire, and comes back up. So when people talk about, oh, this is so complicated because it uses JavaScript, and how am I going to do this? I always just take a step back, and I'm like, okay, if you were able to see this content in your computer, like on your screen, the way it got there is because at some level, your computer composed some text and sent it across a wire, and then a bunch of text came back across the wire and was reformatted.
Yeah.
And when you think about it that way, and that's how all websites operate. That's how forget about web scraping. Just if you think about the beauty of the internet, is that it's essentially just letters moving around through wires, and we have all these sort of protocols that are built on top of it, like HTTP. Is really just a specification that says, okay, if you want to send an HTTP request, what are you doing? Well, you're writing out a particular sequence of letters and numbers. You're writing your request line, you're writing your headers, you're shoving that through the wire, and then when you get a response, it should also conform to this standard where it tells you information about it and things like that. But at the most fundamental level, it's just text.
Yeah.
And so when people talk about, oh, I can't get it because I'm logged in, or there's CSRF protection, or they're doing this stuff with like sign-ons or JavaScript. It's like at some level, a program I use is Charles Web Proxy. There's another really good one called Wireshark, I believe, where basically you can just ask your computer, say, hey, every time you put text on my network card and send it out over the network, let me know what it is, and just let me read it.
That's awesome.
And you'll be able to see, and you can say, oh, when I loaded this. When I scroll down on my Twitter feed and Twitter magically did all this stuff with JavaScript to
load just text, and it told
actually,
you what it
was they sent a request to /timeline.json. They sent some information about a cookie that was who's logged in and maybe what the time offset was, and that went over, and Twitter did all its work, hit their database, hit all their services. And what did the response come back? It wasn't anything crazy. It was just some more text, and it came back. You can read it and you can parse it, and So when you think, once you sort of make that realization, all the rest of those complexities kind of fall away, and you say, okay, at some level, I just need to basically build a string and send that string over the wire and just get a string back and parse it the right way.
I'm so glad you went into that.
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, no, that's awesome. I mean, you think about it, the internet, it's been polished over the years. It's never been overhauled. Like, it's still just text the way it was in the early 90s, just text.
Well, the beauty of it is that's all you really need. I mean, it's simple in that it works very well, and that here we are decades later and we're building these complex applications on it, but it's still the exact same building blocks that we've been using since way back when it was just a few universities connected over some fiber optic cables across the country.
No, I think you're right, though. We get thrown off because it looks so polished and so complicated, and we got Ajax going on and all this stuff, but it's like, at the root, machine code is just ones and zeros. It's just text. Like, even images, we think, images isn't text. No, it's just ones and zeros.
Exactly.
Like, an image is just code.
There's it's not like a series of tubes where the actual Polaroid image is being, faxed to you or something. And even a fax, it's like, what is it? It's bits and bytes converted to text or binary data. And so, once you sort of have that realization, it becomes a lot simpler to think about and not get caught up in the sort of application level stuff where you're talking about logins and cookies and CSRF and JavaScript, but to think about it a little bit lower level and say, what's actually happening? What's happening at the HTTP level? What's happening below the HTTP level? Can I scrape a site that uses FTP instead of HTTP? Sure. You just have to make sure that the text that you send is in the proper format. And I think once you sort of come to that realization, a lot of these things get a lot simpler. And I try to, if I can, I mentioned, I think I have written a book on this, on the Ultimate Guide to Web Scraping, which I think should be in the links below the video.
Yeah.
But I start the book out with that sort of introduction, basically saying, look, whatever you think you know about web scraping, it's probably overly complicated because it's really, really simple. And once you understand these concepts, and you understand how sort of network traffic works, even at just a high level, you don't have to know what the difference between TCP and UDP is. You just know that it's a protocol used for sending information, and you sort of build on it a little bit. It's really powerful, and you start to realize not only applications for web scraping, but applications for web design in general. Like, people are coming out with new protocols that are supposedly better than HTTP. Like, what does that mean? All that means is just people are specifying that the format of the text that you write is a little bit different, and maybe some of the lower level stuff changes. But it really is good if you do any sort of programming in a web context to just sort of think about these things, not just for web scraping, but just in general as a sort of simplifies a lot of the stuff. It can kind of cut through some of the noise about how complex things seem when you realize that it's actually pretty straightforward at some level.
Yeah, no, it's great. Everything you just said totally demystifies it, which is what we want. So that's awesome. So you went to the website, you viewed the source code, they have the data that you want. Is that when you start writing code, or is there any other step after that we're missing?
So usually I want to confirm that I can sort of that I can make programmatic requests and see the same stuff that I saw in my browser. And at first I used to not do that. I used to be like, saw it in my browser, let me jump right into coding. And I would get hung up on these errors where I'd spend hours and hours trying to parse the response. And I was like, why is this? It doesn't have this div that I thought I was going to have. And then I discovered that, this site was like, it required there to be like this weird header that they had set. And my browser was sending it, but I wasn't sending it when I was doing it programmatically. So the response I was getting back was just an error message instead of the actual content of the page. So I use a tool called, I think it's called like REST Client or something like that. You can search for a bunch of them. Basically, it's a visual sort of graphical user interface on top of curl, which is sort of the command line version of making network requests. And it lets you basically say, here's a URL, here's some headers, send this request over the network and just give me all of the raw information that comes back.
So instead of having to actually write the code and put it in a file and execute it, you can just drop it in this thing and see what it pulls back.
Yeah, and actually, I think the thing I use, it's called Postman. It's a Chrome, it used to be a Chrome extension, I think now it's a Chrome app. And it basically, it lets you save things, it gives it a really nice, easy thing. You can say, I want to send a post request, or I want to send a get request, or these other kinds, and you can say, post data and things like that, form data, and it automatically takes care of. Again, at some level, it's just text going over the wire, but it gives you this interface that lets you sort of click and select things, and then it turns it into the text and shoves it over the wire for you. And you can say, oh, interesting, the response that I'm getting back from this site is different than the one that I saw when I was loading in my browser. Let me check. Oh, it looks like when I was doing it in Chrome, Chrome was sending this other header that I forgot to send. Let me add that. Oh, okay, now it's working.
Gotcha. So you do a few tests.
Yeah, basically, you sort of go from having it work when you just click on things in your browser. The next step is, okay, can I reliably build my own HTTP requests by hand and get the same response? And then once I've said, okay, I know what I need to get this HTTP response, then you can sort of dive more into the code and say, all right, let's start scripting some of this stuff and writing it down in code so that I can automate these requests and stuff like that.
So then you start writing code, and I know in your book you actually have code samples, so people should definitely go check out the book, buy it. I think it's only like $10, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's nothing. So go buy it. It's, there's some guy in California making a lot more than $10 off this stuff.
Exactly.
With his property. So you start writing code, like, without getting into like literally what the lines of code say. What is the code doing? Is it just saying, hey, look for this, this header tag, and then pull out the data between the beginning and the end of the H1? Like, is that the kind of thing it's doing, just looking for certain tags and pulling stuff out?
And actually, usually the first thing it does, because usually if you only have one web page, you're probably not using a scraper because you can just go to copy and paste it yourself. Usually we're using a scraper when there's a ton of things. So usually the first, when there's a ton of different pages you need to scrape. So usually the first job of the scraper is to be able to enumerate all the URLs. Okay. And that's sort of can be tricky. Sometimes things are super well formatted, and you have a site where it's like /product/ ID, and then there's just a number, and you can just increment the number by 1 and you just get the next product, and it's super nice like that. Sometimes it's not that straightforward, and you have to actually do what I would say gets into the realm of more of web crawling or web spidering, where basically you're doing the same thing except you don't know what all your URLs are going to be ahead of time, or it's not easy to discover them. A good example of this might be if you're trying to get products on Amazon, and most of the products have some text in the URL that's like the title of the product or some kind of description or something like that. So you don't really know. Let's say you're trying to get all the light bulbs on Amazon. You don't really know until you actually view a page with all the light bulbs on it. And you say, okay, here are all the light bulbs. Now let me go see each of those links and find those. Now I'm going to go scrape those sites. And you have to sort of keep track of what sites you've already scraped. And spidering gets a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, exponentially so, literally.
Yeah. And especially you have to worry about not visiting the same URLs over and over again and getting into infinite loops where if you just click on I did that one time. I wrote a super bad web spider where basically I was like, okay, find the list of every link on the page and then go visit the first link and then do that over and over again recursively.
The first link was the page, wasn't it?
And it basically would just go between these two pages back and forth, and it never got to the other one. So you have to think, and it's a pretty good computer science, kind of classic computer science problem about like you use recursion or looping or how do you keep track of state. It gets especially complicated nowadays if you're scraping hundreds of thousands or millions of pages, and you have a distributed crawler where you have a bunch of different machines that are making the requests, and you have to sort of have a central place where you're keeping the state of where what pages you've hit and what are sort of next up. And it gets even more complicated if you do things like I don't want to slam this site and send too many requests at it all at once, so I got to keep track of the last time that I hit a URL on this site, and then whenever I'm about to hit the next URL, I should check to see if I've already. So it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But usually the first thing that I'm doing is just trying to get to the next page or sort of enumerate the URLs that I need to scrape, and then so once you each application has a different. It's hard to sort of have a one size fits all answer for that, but at a high level, it's sort of that. It's enumerating all the URLs. Then it's just sending the request to each of the URLs that you need, and then it's just saying, okay, great, we got some text back from this HTTP request. Let's, we know where these things are that we need. Here's the title, here's the description, stuff like that. Usually I do most of my stuff in Python. I have used Beautiful Soup a lot. One of my coworkers is trying to convince me that LXML's eTree is better. There's sort of a holy war going on in terms of which is better at parsing HTML. I've been learning it. I find Beautiful Soup a little bit easier, but those are two great Python packages. There's Nokogiri and Ruby. You want to stay away from XML packages. Sometimes you'll hear about people say, "Oh yeah, we can read XML documents," but generally most XML is basically super quick detour. Is another specification of how text should look like, the same way HTTP is, and RSS, and an API. And it has certain rules about nesting, and tags have to be closed, and there's namespaces and stuff like that. Most HTML that you encounter on the web is not XML compliant. It looks similar to XML, and if you look at XML, you're like, oh, this looks like HTTP, or it looks like HTML. It's not. Most HTML pages are not valid XML. So if you try and say, oh, I've got this giant string of text and it's got pointy brackets, let me put it in my XML parser, it's going to be like, this is not valid.
Yeah.
So the HTML parsing is a little bit more tricky because it's kind of more free form, and people don't always nest things properly. They forget to close tags and stuff like that. So it can be ambiguous sometimes what the markup of a site actually looks like. You can imagine, like, if I have a paragraph tag, and then I open that, and then inside I have an italics tag, or let's say an emphasis EM tag, and then I have some text, and then I close the paragraph tag /p, and then I close the emphasis tag /em.
I'm out of order.
Now it's like ambiguous. It's like, well, is the paragraph inside the emphasis tag, or is the emphasis tag inside the paragraph tag? And this stuff is all over the web. Most websites are not actually valid. Even HTML, if you put them in an HTML validator service, they're usually not. So the libraries that you use to sort of parse this text and to give it some structure have to do a bit of guesswork and sort of eliminate some of that ambiguity.
Yeah, they need to be pretty powerful and not just do XML.
Right. Yeah, and some of them are more full featured, and they do XML, they do HTML. LXML was the one that I was mentioning earlier that I'm learning in Python, has a separate, like, sort of HTML parsing thing. They also have the XML one. XML stuff is usually pretty fast because it's so well formed. But talking a bit about performance, I usually don't worry about the performance of my scraping code, and here's why. It's important to keep things in perspective and keep an eye on sort of orders of magnitude of latency and how long things are taking in your application. And you hear people talk about I saw a Y Combinator backed, I won't say who they were, but they put out a blog post basically saying how they were moving from they do a bunch of web scraping, and they're moving from one parsing library to another, and how the reason was because the old one wasn't fast enough. Unless they have some really, like, they're on like a Google Fiber network and they're like super close to the things, most of your slowness is going to be the network. And it's going to take 2 or 3 orders of magnitude more time for the request to go over the network, get to the faraway server, and then come back to your computer. That if you're quabbling over 1 or 2 CPU cycles here and there to do faster XML HTML processing, you're probably focused on the wrong thing. And so a lot. And
I was saying, it seems like the target would have to be a huge target for scraping for speed to matter, because like your guy in California, there's a very finite number of listings every day, every year. Like, it doesn't matter if you speed it up; it's done pretty quick, right?
Exactly.
And that's what a lot of screen scraping is, I think. That people are actually using day to day. The people watching this show, they're not scraping Google. you know?
There's usually, that's another thing, is if there's a finite amount of stuff. Most of the scraping jobs I have, they run overnight. I say, you know what, this might take 4 hours, this might take 6 hours. Like, I don't really know. I'm going to set it up and make sure it works, and then when I wake up in the morning, I'm just going to check on it and make sure that it's still there. But I don't even really, it's definitely not a real-time system. I would never advocate for building like a news feed where, like, when someone logs in, you go out and do some web scraping. Like, that is a horrible. Like, it's all, you only use it sort of for offline data purposes. Sometimes you might do some scraping, you might pull the results of it into a database, and then you might build like a web front end on top of that database to make searching it fast. But there's so many problems. What if the site that you're scraping goes down, or changes their URLs, or changes their markup and something breaks? You never want to have sort of live scraping happening in front of a user. So all my stuff, all the jobs that I've ever done have all been sort of offline, kind of batch stuff where you let them run overnight. They take 4 to 6 to 8 hours, sometimes even a few days. and then you're not really that worried about performance at the sort of like CPU level.
Mm-hmm.
You might be worried about it more at the higher level one, where you're saying, okay, how can I reduce the number of URLs that I need to scrape? Let me do some deduping or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, oh, I don't want to hit the same URL twice. I've already hit it. Like that's a great performance improvement, because now you're not hitting the same URL over and over again
Mm-hmm.
and wasting time doing that. That's great. Talking about which parser is faster for your HTML is probably like the gains you're going to realize are going to be so infinitesimally much smaller than
Mm-hmm.
the amount of time that your application takes that you're probably not going to notice it.
Yeah. So once you scrape the data, so you sent the request, you get the data back that you want, your code has found what it needs, then you store it in a database. Is that the next step? And then,
yeah, I mean, it depends what the sort of uses are for it. Like for a lot of my web scraping clients that I do work for, they are non-technical. They don't know SQL or anything like that. So when I'm doing the scraping, I put it in a database, but then I have a script that reads it out of the database, writes it to a CSV, and then I just email them the CSV, and they can pull it into Excel or whatever. I mean, it depends on sort of what it's, what they need it for and what they're using it for, and who the sort of end user of that data is. And when it's a non-technical person, CSV is usually the easiest, or it's easy to convert that to like Excel or something like that.
Yeah, they can import that into their customer relationship stuff if they have that, or whatever they want to do with it, or they can just open it up and do it manually, whatever.
Exactly.
Now, web scraping can sometimes get a bad name. Is it legitimate to do this? Like, is it legal? Is there anything we should be worried about? I mean, because that's a question that has to come up a lot, right?
Yeah, it's definitely something when people hear web scraping, the word scraping kind of has negative connotations in just like English language in general. It sort of implies like vandalism or something like that. I think to go back to the metaphor I made earlier with the sledgehammer, it's a tool, and you can use it to to knock down your own property when you need to knock something down, or you could use it to go break into your neighbor's house. One of those is legal, one of those isn't. So it really just depends. I think it's unfair to say, and it's actually impossible to say at a high level whether scraping is uniformly legal or uniformly illegal. I would never say that it's always legal, but I also would say that it's not always illegal.
Mm-hmm.
It just depends on what you're doing with the data and how you access it. Yeah. One of the sort of more famous or infamous, depending on your stance, sort of web scraping cases recently is Weave. He was someone who he was sort of an internet troll for a while. A lot of people don't like him, but he basically discovered that on the AT&T website, I forget exactly what it was. It might have been an email address or just even a user ID. If you went to like ATNT.com/iPad/user/ and you put in like a user ID, the site would just spit back like all this information about who that user was. And if you just incremented the number by one, then you'd get the next one and the next one. And he wrote a script that harvested like hundreds of thousands or even millions of these things. And he didn't really practice responsible disclosure. He kind of tried to blackmail AT&T, I think, a little bit with it. I don't know all the details of the case, but he's, I think, currently sitting in a jail cell right now. So he didn't come out too well from that whole thing. But I think it was mostly because of his antagonistic tendencies.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, certainly if you discovered something like that and wrote a script and contacted the site and say, hey, here's a proof of concept I just did. Here's a security vulnerability. I'm not going to release any information about this to the public. I'm going to give you guys a chance to fix it. Like, there's definitely, ethical scraping and things like that. Yeah. A lot of times, like, sites just don't care. Like, they know that they're being scraped, and, they don't feel like having an API. They know that people really, really want their data, and they're just like, whatever. We're not gonna, we're not gonna rate limit you. We're not gonna do anything. Just kind of have at it.
Yeah.
And they're obviously not gonna to get mad. Another case I heard about was a company called PadMapper. Was basically their whole site was basically a Google Maps overlaid with like Craigslist and other sort of apartment data.
Uh-huh.
And Craigslist turned around and said, you know what, actually, we don't want you scraping our data, because Craigslist doesn't have an API. So PadMapper was scraping their data. Craigslist said, we don't want you doing that anymore. And PadMapper was like, okay. And Craigslist like blocked their IP address from scraping. But then PadMapper went ahead and said, you know what, actually, we're going to like generate a new IP address. We're going to keep doing it anyways. And once they did that, now there's actually I think there's a court case still going on where a judge has said, well, okay, now we're actively circumventing this site trying to put up a wall to prevent your behavior, that constitutes like breach of a computer system or something like that. The law is still, these systems are so new, there hasn't been a ton of case law on it yet, so it's hard to say specifically what is and isn't legal yet. But there have been a few high-profile cases that I've been sort of watching to see how things come out. And honestly, a lot of it comes down to very, very specific facts of the case. So it's really hard to say, whether as a tool it's always a good thing or always a bad thing. It really just sort of depends. It depends if the site's trying to throw up blockers and you're trying to actively get around those.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point.
You're opening yourself up a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point when it comes to security and the law. It's not how good is the security and can I circumvent it easily. It's did I try to circumvent it at all? That's a lot of times. It's not that, the password's in the HTML. The fact they had a password on it means you did something to get through it,
Exactly. And I mean, and who's to say, in the Weave case where who's to say that he didn't just find those links in Google and he searched for AT&T iPad and just clicked on them and said, hey, here's a valid link, The fact that he wrote a script and enumerated it and had this sort of hacker persona and pissed a lot of people off, I think all those sort of intangibles counted against him. The technology of just saying, here's a URL. If I visit it a lot, something weird happens. It's ambiguous whether or not that constitutes a breach of the law. But it's sort of the higher level. Is this site actively trying to keep me off, and I'm trying to get around it? Is there some sort of security system that they put in place? Even if the technology is weak, and I'm saying wow, look at these guys, they left a giant hole in their fence. It's like this isn't web scraping related, but there was I don't know if you heard about this. There was a big bug on I think United's website a few months ago where if you pulled up two tabs and you search for a flight over on this one and you search for a flight over on this one and then you close them in a specific order, you and refreshed one, it would say all of a sudden that all your flights were free and people were booking free flights. There's some bug. There's some bug in their booking system, and apparently it happened once before. And they said, you know what? Actually, we'll honor all these things. We think it's great that people are finding these bugs, and we feel bad about it, and it's not your fault. So we'll give it to you. And then it happened again, and I think Mashable wrote about it, and a bunch of other people covered it. And that time they put their foot down. They said, no. We're not going to honor these. You guys, clearly had found a bug in our thing. You were clearly, people were giving instructions to each other about how to, get at the exact sequence of clicks and things to get it to happen. And they said, no, this is obviously, you guys are going out of your way to sneak through a hole in our fence. We're not going to honor this. And I think they did a good job handling it. I think both in the first case when it was sort of my fault, it didn't get out of hand, they dealt with it quickly. And then the second case, people were really exploiting it, and it was going to cost them a lot of money. And, it's like saying, they put a fence around their business, but I was able to climb over it, so I should be able to just steal whatever I want, right? It's it's not really how it works that way. It's not really how it works.
Well, let me ask you, it kind of leads to the next thing. If somebody like Craigslist doesn't want their site scraped, are there things they can do technically to just make it that, hey, this site is unscrapable, or is that not really a possibility given the it's just text thing that we talked about?
Yeah, and I was gonna get back to that, and it's it's an interesting question, and there was a core question I think that was how do you prevent your site from being scraped, and I sort of listed a few things, but at a high level, if someone's determined enough and you have information that's available on your website, it will always be scraped. Any information that you display on your website can be scraped, full stop. And people would do things where they say, okay, if I've had too many requests from one IP address, it's probably a robot, so I'm going to block it. Okay, you can do that, but now if I'm determined enough, I could have hundreds of different things that are all hitting your site at the same time. People try and use captchas and things like that. That's a pretty viable solution. But anything
you
do
a human with a captcha.
Right, so, exactly. Yeah. You say, a human can read this and put in the information, and whereas a computer is going to have a much more difficult time trying to access that. The problem with those things is that they also ruin usability for your average user. And users, while captchas are fantastic at stopping bots, they're also fantastic for pissing off your users.
And sometimes stopping users, you can't even read them half the time.
Exactly. You look at studies where sign-up forms have a CAPTCHA, and you look at the conversion rates before and after they had a CAPTCHA form, and it's an order of magnitude fewer people will fill it out.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm sure you've had this where you sit there and you try and fill out the CAPTCHA 3 or 4 times, and it says incorrect.
Yeah.
You just give up.
I'm a smart dude. If I can't fill this out, this doesn't work.
Exactly. So, things there are definitely things you can do. Another thing is putting your information in some sort of like in a PDF or in an image or something like that, which makes it a lot more difficult to parse. If you have one guy actually just sent me an email about an hour before this saying he was trying to scrape some grocery information, and they were basically, rather than posting on their website, they were releasing these like flyers as PDFs, where it was just a giant image and they had the products and the prices and stuff. But it's much more difficult to do that. So it definitely sort of throws a wrench at any web scraper who might be trying to get at it. But there are optical recognition systems. There are all sorts of ways of doing stuff like that.
Yeah.
I actually know someone back in the early days of Facebook. Now, if you go on Facebook and you see an email address, they actually very rarely post your email address unless you explicitly tell them you want your email address shown. For a while, what they do is you would type in your email address and they would generate a little image. And so it would be an image of the word of your thing. I had a friend who went to MIT back in like the mid 2000s, and they would basically, whenever they would have parties at his frat, they would go scrape Facebook and they would invite tens of thousands of people via email, and they were actually pulling down the email address. Then they were doing some optical character recognition on it to be able to figure out what the letters were. And they actually got an email from, it wasn't Zuckerberg, it was one of the other early employees. I forget his name, but he was like, look, we know you guys are doing this. We're working on something to stop it, but like, just don't be dicks. Like, can you just stop doing it? Like, please.
Yeah.
And it was like, Facebook was actively trying to keep them out, and they were, finding new ways to get around it. So
yeah.
yeah,
That's a fun example. And that kind of, gets into the, being a good web scraping citizen, as you call it in your book. I mean, does that basically come down to, obey the wishes of the site, don't send too many requests in a short period of time,
right.
Don't use the information you get for nefarious purposes. I mean,
Yeah.
Is that basically the way to look at it to be a good citizen?
Yeah, so there's some common sense stuff like that. There's just a general like, don't be a dick about it. But there are actually some more formal standards that that a lot of websites try to use to sort of talk to scrapers. I mean, one of the most common, the most common scraper in the world is the Googlebot. It goes around and visits every single page on the internet, every few hours or days or something like that. So it's all around. So there's actually there's a standard called the Robots Exclusion Protocol, where basically you put up a file. So it's your domain / robots.txt. And if you Google it, there you can read about what the spec looks like. But you can basically tell a robot, you say, okay, here are the directories that you're allowed to scrape, but here are the ones that I don't want you to scrape. And so if you're building any kind of scraper or web crawler or something like that, and a lot of the open source ones that you find, the open source ones will automatically, most of them will say, okay, before we visit any pages on this domain, let's look at their robots.txt file. Let's make sure that we're not violating the sort of webmaster's guidelines about what they do and don't want scraped. So there's that. Another best practice is to sort of throttle your requests. So you basically time when you send a request for how long it takes for it to come back, and you delay your next request at least 10x whatever that amount is. So if the site comes back and it's super fast and it comes back in half a second, okay, you wait 5 seconds to send the next request. If the site starts to slow down and it's taken 5-10 seconds to serve a request, it's like you're probably hammering it. You really need, and it's also just like, a web server can only do so much at a time. Waiting 10x what the time it takes you to get your response means that you're letting 10 other people in that time have unfettered access to the web server, and then you're getting back in line and doing it again.
I gotcha.
So it's sort of a good rule of thumb in terms of not overwhelming a web server, not taking too many of its resources.
Yeah, you don't want to have like a denial of service from scraping.
Yeah, and it's really easy. I've written scripts that had bugs and didn't do things properly, and then you end up sending dozens or hundreds of requests in a very, very short period, seconds, and you can accidentally knock sites offline, which is super counterproductive because now you can't get any information, you can't do your scraping. So even just selfishly, you want to make sure that you're slow enough that the web server has time to respond and keep itself up. But also, just as a good citizen on net, you want to make sure that you're letting other people have access to that site as well, and you're not.
That's great. That's a good way to look at it. Now tell us again, what's the website where we can get the book to actually go into more detail and get some actual code to do this?
Yeah, so the book is actually on my blog. It should be in the links below. My site is just blog.hartleybrody.com. I think I have a link in the sidebar to buy the book. It's on my site. It's only $10. And actually, you know what? I'm gonna add a coupon code
Yeah,
I'm
do it.
going to do this right now. If you just put in growth hack, I will immediately after this go set up a coupon code for 20% off.
Perfect.
So it'll be like $8 or something like that. So that'll
See,
be
that's a
a
man that knows how to market right there. Take the
yeah,
opportunities you
exactly.
have, use a promo code, incentivize people.
And
It
it's good for
works.
analytics because now I can tell where the purchases are coming from if they're coming from
Absolutely, you
your
can
site.
track it. I mean, it's the way the world works. You know what
It
you're
is.
doing. No,
So
that's awesome.
no, it's
Well,
great. But yeah, I definitely I basically wrote it with the expectation that you know almost nothing about anything. Which
mhm.
I hope don't mean that for that to sound condescending. I mean for it to be like, let's go back to the basic. Let's talk
Yeah.
about how the internet works, how HTML works, and then we start to build on those things and look at here are some common pitfalls. Here's some things to watch out for. Here's how to
Mhm.
follow these sort of best practices about being a good web scraping citizen and things like that.
Yeah, that's
So
awesome. I would definitely recommend everybody to pick it up and read it. Now, let me ask you this kind of as a final question. This
sure.
interview's been awesome. People are going to love it. But you do so much related to growth. I mean, scraping is just one little piece of really what you do, and probably not even the main piece, really.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, when you look at startups right now, what's the best advice that you have for any startup that's trying to grow? It may be scraping related, but it probably won't be.
The yeah, no, I would say it's not. I would say, and this is something I've learned pretty recently is that find pay attention to new platforms that users are using. Um, when Facebook like first had the news feed and they opened up their platform API, I mean, you remember those apps where it was like invite your friends to like Mafia Wars and stuff like that. Like,
Hmm.
you know, companies exploded on the backs of that because it was like, wow, like look all these ways we can reach new users. But once it's been out in the market for a while, users sort of get more numb to it. The platform usually clamps down. It's okay, you can't be that spammy.
Hmm.
But there are tons and tons of these platforms that people use that aren't just the traditional social media sites and search engines that you can use to promote your stuff. I was talking to a friend who does growth at an online sort of place where people can post online classes and things like that.
Hmm.
And he was saying that they used to have one app for their whole company, and you would go to the app store and you have to search for the name of their learning company and you'd get their app. But then they realized people are actually we have courses on guitar lessons, we have courses on golf and programming and
Hmm.
all these things. We should really make apps for each one of these individual classes. And so they sort of had this like cookie cutter approach. They said, okay, each instructor when they make a class gets to set up their own app, and we'll put it in the iOS store for them. And they saw signups like explode because all of a sudden people who were going to the app store and maybe searching for oh, I'm at the golf course and I need to work on this. Let me just see if there's any good apps. There's like only a handful of golf apps. If you try
Hmm.
and rank for golf app on Google, there's hundreds or thousands of sites you're competing against. But there are a lot of these new platforms, even some of the big ones like the iOS store,
Hmm.
the Chrome app store, Android store. There's a lot of these stores where even if your product doesn't necessarily lend itself to that, there are ways that you can kind of do user acquisition through that. I
Hmm.
actively promote my book through my website, but I also use LeanPub because they help with like the formatting and converting the markdown to like a PDF, and it's a great service. I highly
Hmm.
recommend it. But they also have like a storefront, and I put like exactly zero effort into my storefront on their site. I should probably do a better job, but I get random sales, people who I would never go to think to buy a book on LeanPub, but there are lots of people that do, or they
Hmm.
bought, they heard of some other book that was there, so they look around and they discover mine accidentally. There's all these other platforms that people are doing searches and looking for content.
Hmm.
Don't underestimate the value of some really niche thing. If you think users are on it and they're searching for things that are related to your product, like get on it. Be one of the first people on it, and
Hmm.
you'll often see you'll be able to ride that. Often, by the time they say like once there's already a case study been written on an industry or
It's
tactic,
too
it's too
late.
late to get in on it. So it's like you really want to find these things.
You want to be the case study. You want to be the
Exactly, you want to
example
be
of
the
look
case
how this
study. You
guy
want to
did this
be
thing.
exactly, and I think I think the online learning class I think is going to be one of the ones that really is at the forefront of doing this sort of cookie cutter app stuff. They have to make sure that they toe the line with Apple's guidelines because Apple has some
Hmm.
sort of don't be spammy. So they have to sort of but they're sort of on the edge of that, figuring out okay, we're not trying to be spammy, but we're trying to like
Yeah.
get a lot of
And it
users.
could be good for Apple's people as well. It could be good for the users to find the app they actually wanted when there wasn't a lot of them, and they weren't just putting random keywords for like SEO stuffing purposes. That's what the app really is, you know?
Right, exactly. And usually by the time the spammers are in there, it's too late. So you want to be the first spammer, quote unquote, where hopefully you're providing value. You're not tricking users, but any startup that you're passionate about, there's got to be ways that you can sort of find these new platforms that users are using to look for things and discover things, and get on and just try to get on them.
Yeah, no, that's great. The difference between being a spammer and being somebody who's awesome is just value. You can provide value at scale, and it's awesome. You provide, not value at scale, it's called spam.
Yeah.
So, just provide value, and things work themselves out. Well, Hartley, this has been a great interview. We'll end on your advice to be the first in these new channels, really take advantage of them. And thanks again for coming on Growth Hacker TV.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I had a great time talking about the SEO stuff that you guys are doing. Hope to see you guys moving up in the search results pretty soon. And I'm happy to talk about this kind of stuff. I don't do marketing sort of full time anymore. I'm a full stack web developer at a startup, but I love having these conversations. So I think there'll probably be a Clarity link in the links below. If you want to give me a call, if you're in the Boston area, I'm happy to get lunch or coffee or something like that. But yeah, I love to talk about this stuff. Love to help.
That's awesome, Hartley. Thanks again.
Yeah.